later. So that should be recording now. And I am going to move to our initial, excuse me. Just 1 second, my screen has frozen. Oh dear. Bear with me for 1 second. I am frozen. I cannot see anybody, and I can't seem to do much with my controls. I can't even seem to stop sharing. Ken, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
I don't think there's a way that you can share your screen, is there?
Let me try. I can try to over.
This PowerPoint has killed my Zoom, apparently. Because if you can knock me out of here, that would be great.
I just tried and it will not let me override you.
Oh my goodness. Hang on 1 second. Something is happening. I believe you can see my power. Zoom is okay. Can you see my PowerPoint? I think I'm out of it.
There you go.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Sorry about that. It wouldn't be a TPS webinar without a little bit of technical difficulty. Well, Kira is off this week, and so I am Stacy Graham with the TPS-MTSU program, and I am joined by Ken Mosier, our graduate research assistant and teacher in residence. And so I'm going to go through some of our basic introductory PowerPoint slides and then introduce you to this month's newsletter with the theme of history is storytelling. And then after my introduction, I'm going to turn things over to Ken so that he can elaborate on all the great materials that he's created that are new to our website that are on this theme. So welcome again, everybody. And let's see, here we go. Now, thank you. Most of you are already veterans of our webinars, and so you know all of this. So thank you for keeping your mics muted. It just helps cut back on feedback. And I can see all your names, but if your Zoom kicks you out and you come back with a phone number or something, make sure that we can read your name. And we do have ways to interact. Zoom has not been my friend today. It wouldn't let me create a poll, which I was going to do because we haven't done that in a while. But I was hoping to have everybody kind of drop into the chat box where they hear, since we're looking at the theme of history of storytelling, where do you get your stories? Maybe the best ones, the ones you like to use when you are trying to teach history to students. Like, what kind of stories do you bring in? And I will start off by saying that when I'm teaching, for instance, if I'm teaching the history of the Roman Empire to my students, I actually bring in movie clips because they're a great way to kind of take a topic and, nest it in a visual story, and then we discuss how that touches on what they've actually read in their textbooks or primary sources. Sometimes stories are not the best fact bearers, but they're really great for giving sense of the past that is hard to get from a lot of teacher materials. So if you want to drop those comments in the chat box, I'll read them in just a moment. We do have a Padlet as always, and this is the same URL as it is every week, and every month. And I have placed the PowerPoint that Ken will be using onto this Padlet. If any of you want to access it later, you can do so at this link or at this QR code. And I'm going to be returning to this URL and this QR code at the end of our webinar today so that you can fill out the survey form. And this, of course, is what gets you your PD credit will send you a certificate later. So that is all I'm going to share right now. I was able to exit it just fine. And I want to read just a little bit before I get to the newsletter, what a couple of you are saying about where you like to get your stories. So a 92-year-old mother, that's really great that she is still around. And so our parents, right? A really great place to get stories from. Please get those before you can no longer access them. Okay, and then Heather says, I like to locate personal or odd trivia about people who lived during the time period and share that. Oh yes, that's a really great way to start a class, to engage students, and also if it's odd enough, they will remember that the rest of their lives. And then Livy says, grandparents. Yeah, I was lucky enough to have a grandmother who lived to be 103, and her very first memory was when she had the flu when she was 4 years old. And she was 4 years old in the year 1918. So, which flu is she referring to? The Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. And that's just crazy that that had such a direct impact on my family. Luckily, obviously, she survived. But yeah, our families, they're the first places that we get our stories from. Your students, their parents might even be younger than you are, but that doesn't mean that their parents and grandparents don't have really great stories. You just have to remind them that their parents are interesting people that they should talk to every now and then, right? Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and open up the newsletter once I close out of this. So where is our newsletter? I'm going to share my screen. Fingers crossed, y'all, that this works better than last time. All right, I think that worked. I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger because I know it might be a little small out there, especially if you're watching from the YouTubes. So here we have an extended blurb about history's storytelling. I, of course, had to throw in a reference to our very first historian in the Western tradition, Herodotus, because he was one of the best storytellers and still is. And that idea of stories maybe being different from history as a way to record information was kind of a really important mental distinction. And so that, of course, we can attribute to the ancient Greeks in our Western tradition, of course. And then there's some links to some YouTube videos and TED Talks and things like that about the power of stories, if you're interested in that. Now, the second page is all Ken's work, so I'm going to let him talk about that. And I'll come in afterwards and maybe point out some of our important links. But I did want to bring some attention to this story that we have on page 3 that was contributed by our other graduate research assistant, Ryder Cowart, whom you all met last month. And he wrote a story about rationing during World War II. And it's a story about a woman named Nona Poe. And it turns out that was Ryder's grandmother. And so that's where he heard that story, as some of you have said that you've heard of, stories from your family. And so it's really cool to be able to connect these stories that are passed down in your family to actual, national trends and curriculum standards and primary sources that you can find on the Library of Congress. And I think students are going to, be really moved to be able to see themselves in history and act, oh, my family lived history. Oh, okay, we're part of it too. And that's just a really important realization for them, as you all know. So this is a little bit of an extended lesson idea that Ryder wrote that ties into a Smithsonian exhibition on the rationing process during World War II that brings in 9 primary sources and does some image analysis with them. And then he links to a longer article that he wrote that's available that talks about rationing. That's good for you to read if you want to bring in some historical context, or if you work with high school students, have them read this. It's a great supplement to any kind of home front information they might read about in their textbook. And we also have a little bit of a featured feature where we combed through some of our back lesson plans to see which ones fit this theme very well. And so we picked out a lesson plan that we had done on that very famous image of the migrant mother by Dorothea Lange, because there's a really interesting story about that woman whose name is Florence Thompson, and how she felt about being immortalized in that photo. And then we also point to Jacob Riis and his images of a lot of immigrant families in New York tenements at the turn of the 20th century, and how those images really tell story themselves, but also he wrote the story that goes with them called How the Other Half Lives, where he's writing nonfiction, but he writes it in a real narrative way that kind of reads like a Dickens novel every now and then. And so we have a lesson plan that goes with that and a close reading exercise. And then I did a 10-minute video where I go through the close reading exercise that's on YouTube. So you can either look at the worksheet or you can have the video accompaniment with that. And then on page 4, we always have our additional sources. So here we have just 4 varied sources on different topics, but links to how you can find good stories and ideas for how to work those in. So that's what I want to go through now, and I'll come back at the end and just fill up with the final kind of housekeeping details. So I'm going to turn things over to Ken by, there we go, I stopped sharing, and now I'm going to mute myself. Go ahead, Ken.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Graham. So as I said in my piece on page 2 in the newsletter, when I was given the task of going through 8th grade standards in particular and thinking about how to help teachers most, storytelling is what I ultimately settled on. And for me, it was a very personal thing. For one, I fell in love with history, largely because of the way that my advanced placement U.S. history teacher told stories when I was in high school. He is the sole reason why I'm a historian today. And also because I sat for a while and just thought about what a younger me would have wanted and what I lacked. Like I said in the newsletter, I was given all sorts of stuff when I became a teacher. I came in with the team rubric, so I got a stack of papers related to that. I came in with the PLC becoming a real push in Rutherford County. So I was given all sorts of resources through my professional learning community. I had the standards, of course. I had the textbooks. I had the handouts. I had overhead transparencies from my mentor that I ended up taking over for that. Some of the documents he gave me was from 1976. And all of that was great, but what was I lacking then that if I could go back and talk to that person 13 years ago, how could I help them? What would be most useful? I still have that overhead, by the way. I see that overhead transparency shout out. I have it in the back of my room as a reminder every time I make a PowerPoint that it could be worse. So I set out to reimagine the essential learning standards for 8th grade as dictated by Rutherford County. So these are the essential standards as Rutherford County sees them, using stories and using narrative. So before I look at those particularly with you guys, I wanted to also share with you a professional development I did for Rutherford County about this topic of using narrative and storytelling to build content knowledge. So I will throw that up on the screen. Okay. So the good news out of any teacher that seeks to use narrative, we really have it the best. Our entire lens is through humanity's greatest guidebook, which is human experience. And whether you're in the history classes particularly, or economics or government or sociology or psychology, we are all able to tap into this vast well of highly accessible, highly interesting storyline if we only are given the room by our administrators and given the room by ourselves to use it. We can engage students if we arrange things correctly. And this is where most things go off the rails because of the limited amount of time that the state or that our counties give us because of the emphasis on literacy and numeracy through English and math classes, because of the state standards that we're told to hit, because of the nature of standardized testing. Sometimes it is near on inevitable, it feels like, becoming a rote information machine where we are pushing out data pieces to students that they need to know to answer some of the questions, and then becoming English teachers and simply trying to teach reading skills of these disjointed sources that are not fully contextualized because we are wanting students to be able to pick out particular literary tools that we think will help them answer questions on the state test, or because we've been told to through our PLCs to work with another PLC. But here's the thing. There's plenty of research from the 1930s to present that shows that just teaching reading skills to students, absent prior knowledge and absent the ability to really wrestle with challenging texts, we're talking about texts that may be frowned upon as above grade level, just teaching those reading skills by themselves doesn't help students, not to the degree that we like to pretend that they do, and that standardized tests like to pretend that they do. And we have an opportunity in social studies to remedy this. So to illustrate the point of the role we have to play in building content knowledge and how important just content knowledge is, I'll start with Recht and Leslie's 1988 baseball study. I love this thing. Basically, a group of students were tasked with reading a passage about a half inning of a fictional baseball game. They were given a baseball diamond in the form of a board and little wooden figures that they needed to move around in order to reenact the action described. So there's a small portion of the half inning description there at the bottom of the screen. I'll give you a second to look over that. And so now I'll go into teacher mode for a second and ask what your expectations are. What students do you think did the best in terms of accurately reproducing on the board the action that they were reading about? You can unmute or use the chat, either way. Yeah, that would make sense. We intuitively go to that. Students who know how to play baseball, yes, because they can recognize the words and actions being referenced in the passage. But what about a student who had a high level of reading, who had gotten every reading skill possible from their English teacher? They annihilate that Pearson test and show it who's boss. Would they be able to perform as well on this task? Yeah, might as well all be Greek. Yeah, let's look at what actually happened here. So here were the results. On the left, you had the students with the highest comprehension, and no surprise, it's the students who had high reading ability and a deep knowledge of baseball because they played it or they followed it religiously. Yeah, those students are going to move it around the best. I think the real surpriser is the column that comes next, right? The next highest column, dropping less than 10 percentage points in terms of comprehension, were students who had a low reading ability by all classical measures, but high content knowledge. Yeah, they might not have been able to tell you what part of the sentence they were in if they were asked to diagram it as they read through it, but they can pick up on the words and actions being used and reason it out. They can fill in the gaps. The next column are those high ability readers that don't know anything about baseball, but the drop is pretty dramatic, right? You're talking a 30 percentage point drop from the students who had a lot of content knowledge, but can't read all that well, to students who read really well, but have no idea what's going on in baseball. And then look at the percentage drop to the final group, low content knowledge, low reading ability. Again, the percentage drop goes small again, right? Those two columns, those two groups of students are fairly close to each other. Now, we're social studies teachers. When I gave this presentation, at least half the people in the room were coaches. At the high school level, that's unavoidable. And so I figured, okay, I need to really replicate something that would feel more like what a student went through. And most of us, because we're, Americans, it's the American pastime. We can recognize something about baseball. That last passage might not have seemed too difficult. So let's switch to cricket. This is fun. Everybody take a second and read the passage of the action going on in a cricket game. There was a previous mention from Elizabeth of it might as well be Greek. Yeah, there's Greek. There's true Greek. Think of how many degrees we have in this little webinar right now, how many years of experience we have, how many books that we have read. We all have a pretty high reading level, yet it doesn't mean a hill of beans without our content knowledge backing us up. And very few of us, I would think, have content knowledge of cricket. And so we look at this, something like this, and it's absolutely baffling. And this is what our students face when we give them reading passages. And it doesn't matter if it's above grade level or at grade level or below grade level. If there's no content to back it up, they're going to struggle. So our job then as social studies teachers is to use our vast pool of knowledge. That's not bragging, that's the nature of the field, right? As we teach history, we automatically have to teach economics, we have to teach government, we get into scientific discoveries. Depending on the time period of history, we might touch on some mathematics, some innovations going on there. We really cover the field, pardon the past sports reference. So we can do more scaffolding than pretty much anyone else. That's great. The problem is no one's interested in the poles and the planks of the scaffolding. How do we get students actually engaged with all of this content knowledge that we have? Because from a high schooler's point of view, it's not all that entertaining. I came into my first history classes. I watched History Channel. That's all well and good. But at the end of the day, history is history. I was more of an English guy, actually, or early on. The number one thing I hear from students coming into even my AP US history classes is they don't necessarily like history. Some of them hate it, and that drives them into AP even more because they're like, I never want to take this again. I do not want it at the college level. Please, dear God, let me pass this test because I hate memorizing names, dates, places, events. That's the number one thing I hear. So how do we overcome that? And the answer is narrative. We go back to what we were built on. We go back to telling a story in a way that engages people where they are, that brings out more detail and more humanity in the people and places that we are discussing, right? One way I like to think about this is if I were to hand you the script of even the biggest blockbuster movie right now and just took the script and bulleted it down to its main points and put timestamps on it of here's where it happened in the sequence of the movie and said, here, what do you think about this movie? Most people's eyes are going to glaze over because all the meaningful stuff has been removed. All the humanity has been removed. And so as teachers, we have the unenviable task of not only being the director of this movie, where we know the script, it's already been written, but we have to bring it to life. But oftentimes we are the sole actors in this movie as well. We're the ones in front of the class actually facilitating the action going on. Now you can have students act things out. That is a whole different story. But for the most part, it's us. So what are the advantages of doing this? What are the advantages of taking the time and effort to go out and find these stories and actually tell them in entertaining ways that at times as a teacher, you feel like you're being overly dramatic, but that's fine if it gets the job done. One, it holds students' attention in a mode that feels both familiar and novel in their technology-based lives. One of the things I've started to hear from students really frequently is that they're burned out on technology. They have been near-potted and cahooted and schoologied out of all comprehension. When I started 13 years ago, the idea of using technology in the classroom and hey, let's let them get their phones out. That was novel and cool. And the kids thought it was novel and cool too. What I hear from my students now is they just don't want to do it again. They're burned out. Every teacher's doing it. And when they're not engaging with technology in the classroom, they're engaging with technology in their spare time. And so they can't get a break from it. And many report, and this goes against everything that you might hear in some education spaces, that a story well told is actually now the novel thing. That's what holds their attention because they're not getting it anywhere else. Yes, the L word, lecture, is coming back. It's being forced back into existence because of the digital nature of their lives in every other moment of the day. So if we can tell this story well, we are giving them something that they're not used to. We are also engaging prior knowledge that came from past classwork, personal interests, life experiences, and that's validating, right? The more you scaffold information, the more stories you tell, the more likely you're going to link up with them somewhere. And once that link happens, that's kind of a gasp aha moment because now they're more vested in the story that you're going to tell. Provides tantalizing cliffhangers into deeper learning. I take great pride in that at every class, I kind of carefully watch the clock as I'm going through my story. And as I get to 5 minutes, I'm going to decide how am I going to do my cliffhanger at the end of this lesson? What am I going to say that I'm going to get them really jazzed and bring them right to that edge? And I'm going to say, see you next time. I love doing that. And they actually end up loving it too. And it doesn't have to be something that just happens at the end of a lesson. It can also be used as something that leads into primary source analysis, leads into group work. You bring them right to that edge to where they're dying to know more, despite their best efforts, they actually want to know more. And then you drop it and you give them a way to go investigate and find it out themselves. We use narrative to scaffold new knowledge necessary for working with a complex text. Students need to be pressed. They can read more than we give them credit for. One of the things I actually hate is this whole idea of on grade level reading. Give them something that's harder. They'll be able to get it as long as you've given them enough ahead of time for them to decode it and to wrestle with it and figure it out. We can give them the cricket passage, but we're going to have to talk for cricket a little while beforehand. And it allows us to perform tasks beyond creation and assessment. That's where we get a little selfish, right? We don't want to only create all of these digital tools and all of these packets and all of these handouts and these different types of assessments and prompts. So many of us got into this because we loved storytellers and we loved storytelling. And in this, we have the opportunity to kind of rediscover that again. One of the books that I absolutely love that led into a lot of this presentation is Kate Wexler's The Knowledge Gap. Natalie Wexler, I'm sorry. Natalie Wexler's The Knowledge Gap. It's mainly written for elementary social studies and science teachers, but as a high school teacher, I found it very refreshing as well. And what she sees is also what I've seen. So it was incredibly validating. But in that text, she says the implication is clear. Abstract reading ability is largely a mirage constructed by reading tests. A student's ability to comprehend a text will vary depending on his familiarity with the subject. No degree of skill will help if he lacks knowledge to understand it. While instruction in early grades is focused on learning to read rather than reading to learn, educators have overlooked the fact that the part of learning to read is acquired knowledge. That's our task, to give them more knowledge through narrative that they're actually going to retain and listen to. As Dr. Graham said earlier, that one weird thing that you tell them, that one story they've never heard before is probably the one thing that's going to stick with them for years and years and years. And the hope is that we can stick on some other knowledge to that sticky glob of interesting, right? That one weird thing that we can attach other things to it to try and increase their understanding. Now, we're public school teachers. There are challenges here, and that has to be acknowledged. And that's where we get to dealing with the Matthew effect. So as Wexler points out, children of wealthier and more educated parents may not be getting any more knowledge at school in the classic, let's learn reading skills context than your disadvantaged students. But they do acquire a lot more outside of school than their disadvantaged peers. And Wexler attributes this to differences in parenting style, that middle and affluent families practice what she calls concerted cultivation, that there may be discussions about history or politics or society at the dinner table, at the family vacation, going to the historic sites, building up, sometimes kicking and screaming on the part of the students, a body of knowledge that they can tap into later when they're confronted with the baseball or the cricket style passage. They have something there, history speaking or socially speaking. Where economically disadvantaged and working class families are more natural growth parenting. The family is trying to survive and the student is trying to survive. And there's less of that direct concerted cultivation or concerted, excuse me, cultivation of content knowledge. Now, this is generalization. We all know those families on both ends that annihilate this generalization. But it is useful, I think, especially for us, because the snowball effect is something that we can affect, right? If in general, this gap is emerging because of what's going on at home and other subjects are not able to fill that gap with this broad, deep web of knowledge that we have the opportunity to tap into, we can kind of step in and stop the flood. At least try to lift the disadvantaged student up in a way that they might not otherwise ever be exposed to. So the roles we play best. This is a little bit just of an overview, and then we'll get back into my examples really quickly. We are custom built to fill gaps in prior knowledge, thanks to the breadth of subjects we cover. More than any other department, we can equalize the Matthew effect across socioeconomic backgrounds because of that breadth of subject matter. It's never too late to fill empty mental pages and augment the effectiveness of reading skills. They've been beaten over the head with reading skills. They got it. They know how to spot symbolism. They got irony. They're good. What they need is a framework in which to apply those skills. And students do not need to learn everything to reap the benefits. They just need to acquire more. More is better. We don't have to hit everything. That can be a trap in our particular field that, well, how do we teach them everything? And from the student's point of view, how do I possibly learn everything? You don't, and you don't. The goal is just more. Now, one final note here, we do not have to be the only narrative builders. Magic happens in the process of writing. And whether by hand, by computer, or voice activation, you can set a process into motion, a kind of shifting series of triangulations between fingers, blank pages, or screens, letters, and words and eyes, synapses, and other neural instantations that are going to create longer lasting impressions of the history we're trying to teach when we tell them to build that story. When we tell them, okay, you take evidence now and tell me a story with it. I'm going to give you everything you need, but you put it together. That act of creation builds understanding that is far beyond anything that rote memorization can teach or that reading for comprehension can teach. And end of the day, my advice to every teacher, whether you're going into this strategy or something else, is teach like the expert you are. Because if you want them to follow your narrative, if you want them to buy into it, you've got to present yourself as authentically skilled and informed as you actually are. And so narrative storytelling takes confidence. You should have that confidence. You're in this profession. You've survived this profession, and you've survived everything to get into this profession. Now it's time to just pass it on. So with that, I believe that you see this guide to the 8th grade standard now. I'm operating Zoom share screen appropriately. Yes. Okay, good. I'm still mildly electronically competent. Okay. So what was in the newsletter last week on page 2 were links to those 8th grade essential learning standards. And what we have done is put together a collection of sources, 3 to 4, so that it's not overwhelming, related to each standard. Each source has a setup, so suggestions for how to begin the lesson, maybe in some more traditional ways, maybe with some prior reading that you give them that's at an accessible level. Sort of the stuff that they're already kind of expecting in the particular era or the particular time period. right? So, oh, the British economic policies following the 7 Years' War. That's the kind of stuff that turns students off right away. But the good news is we're just scaffolding at this point. This isn't the whole lesson. It's just getting them some basic information to chew on when we go into the actual narrative part. So after a source or series of sources related to that particular standard, we go into the actual narrative storytelling. When I wrote these things, I pulled together multiple sources from across the Library of Congress, the internet in general, the texts that I had in my own classroom, looking for something that was more humanistic than the way we typically tell it. A lot of the stories focus on a single individual and tell something through their eyes, or at least looking down on them omnipotently to watch the action unfold. Yes, thank you, Dr. For the link. So in this case, we zoom in and we start paying attention to Private Hugh White. This is a name you're not going to encounter in most history books. Even the Bailey text in all of its infinite detail for AP US history just kind of glazes over this instance. You never meet Private White in the course of that particular story. But we focus on him because we want to put students in his shoes, put them in the shoes of a British soldier who has been given this terrible task of standing guard on this bitterly cold night when all heck suddenly breaks loose, and breaks loose in interesting ways as Bostonians gather in mobs and start harassing guys like him. And when he calls on his buddies to come and protect them, and they all get pinned down, bad things happen. Now, one of the points of this source, and in the second source in the narrative that follows this one, is to flip the script on the beginning of the American War for Independence and get students to look at things through a British perspective. That catches their attention because they're all used to the flag waving, bottle rocket in your back pocket, eagle on your shoulder narrative about the big bad British and the virtuous Bostonians and fighting back against all these unjust laws. Well, it looks a little different when you're the one wearing the red coat and you're half frozen. And now you got these jerks pelting you with rock-filled snowballs. And somebody at some point yelled fire. So you could tell this story in its entirety. I rarely, tell the same story class to class. The exact sentences change. I don't like to read, but I'll read something like this ahead of time to kind of build that story. And then I'm going to try and, dramatize it in front of the class, putting in pauses, giving them time to kind of think as the narrative unfolds, anticipate what's about to happen, and then hopefully surprise them when what they're expecting doesn't necessarily come to pass. After the narrative, there's an activity that asks them to engage in sources. Both this first activity and the second activity that goes with the next source deals with visual representations of history and actually gets them digging into source reliability too. Checking sources, good citizenship in terms of not believing everything that you see or read come into this as well and slip their way in. But here we're kind of reframing Paul Revere, asking students to first look at his images. What's he doing? How is he portraying things? Why do you think he's portraying things the way he is? Then asking him to go and actually read up on Paul Revere. What's went on in his life? Who is this guy who's drawing these things? And then come back and go, okay, now what do you think? Right? What's his angle now, if he has one? And then let's flip it one more time. You're the guy writing in the rival newspaper on the British side. You got to draw a cartoon to go up against Paul Revere's. How do you draw it? What do you include? Why? Where do you put it? Right? How are you going to try and disseminate it beyond just your newspaper? Who's your target audience? And so sources 1 and 2 both follow that mode. Source 3 goes into more textual analysis, this time going over and looking at William Pitt, a name that does appear in most history textbooks, but you never actually read about the guy and what it would have been like to be in the room with him, which, by the way, would have been insufferable. But he's complex, right? Again, the big bad British, Really, they may have some perspectives that surprise you that coexist side by side with perspectives that don't surprise you. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson was not the only one that suffered from that affliction. There's lots of people that are holding dueling ideologies in their heads at once. Pitt was one of them. And so then asking students to go through, deal with him individually, read a speech of his in the House of Lords, and untangle how the British are perceiving this now. And then finally, source number 4, it's not me, it's you. We go to Jefferson, right? The one that's most likely to make an appearance in most history textbooks, his writing of the Declaration of Independence, but kind of reframing it as, he's not sitting in this likely, sunlit grand room that is just ringing with patriotic music as the words flow from his pen. No, that this is a uncomfortable process that he really would not rather be doing something else. And it doesn't just flow from his pen. He goes through and makes edit after edit. His co-writers make edit after edit. The committees that look at it make edit after edit, being very careful and close with their language. And this caps the narrative sequence because by this point, students have got a sense that the Americans are not all angels here. There's very real reason why the rest of the world might not be convinced when the Americans say that the British are the big bad. And so how does that play in with how careful they're being about their word choice, what they're adding, what they're subtracting? Gives the document itself a little more life than what it might otherwise have if just given to a student and you say, read this and use your reading skills to break down what are Jefferson's main points. That's the kind of stuff that I think falls flat with students a lot. If you ask them to try and get into Jefferson's head and into the heads of the people around him, and make him a real person in a very real situation that's very sticky and very complicated and very messy. Students get into it and they stop calling him, President Jefferson, and you'll start hearing him say Tom and T-Jeff and TJ, because suddenly he's real and he's got real problems. So yeah, I know TJ's or Jeffy. I like Jeffy, right? His ships were the little Jeffy. So you got Jeffy's good. So that's my approach. Can you do it with every lesson? No, that's one of the fallacies with teaching, right? There's some idea and you're told you should do it every single day. You can't do this every single day, but it is a way to kind of throw your students a curveball that's not technology based, that get them engaged in viewing history a little better. And hopefully you get that one sticky glob of interestingness that you can then start to stick other content knowledge to. And when they leave you and they encounter the cricket passages that just happen to be history passages, they can decode it and understand it and not just walk away feeling defeated.
Thank you for that. I don't think I'm ever going to understand cricket, but the idea there is very striking that the words make sense, but the meaning is not there. And so I think that, yeah, it might be putting the cart before the horse to be emphasizing reading skills at the expense of, the content knowledge. And of course, we as educators, we always do both at the same time. And so it's really, it's hard for me to remember because I don't deal with this on a day-to-day basis like you all do, that you can't take things for granted. And of course, I'm also forced to face this with my students as well. Right now I'm teaching medieval history, which is not something that their grandparents ever told them stories about. So it's a bit harder to relate to. And so I have to constantly stop myself and be like, maybe I should define this word, or maybe I shouldn't expect that everybody even knows where this is on the map. And speaking about maps, there was actually some resources I wanted to bring everybody's attention to before we wrap up today. And those are on page 2 of the newsletter, which is, of course, it's the same page that Ken's article was on. So I am going to share my screen. Share. Okay. I'm going to share my screen so that you're looking at the newsletter now, and you're looking at page 2. And of course, we always have our important links box on page 2. So I just wanted to show everybody kind of what some of these things are in case you want to go back and take a closer look at them later. But the reason why I have that wonderful segue into maps being a great basis for stories is that story maps are a really wonderful tool that are getting more and more popular that you can find on the internet. These are something that a lot of the public history graduate students here at MTSU learn how to create for public history projects because there's such a great way to engage the general public that has just a basic kind of knowledge into a story, but also place it into historic context. So I'm going to show you one example of those right now, which is from the Library of Congress about civil rights in particularly the Deep South. And so, these are the kinds of things that students can spend a few minutes on, or they can spend a lot more time on. So I like these because you can kind of scroll through really fast, which I know all your students know how to do. Or they can take the time and kind of delve into some of these links and images a bit more. So here's where we're looking at right now, these properties across the Black Belt, starting out, of course, with the story of Emmett Till to set the context for what these people kind of had in their minds as happening 10 years before a lot of the civil rights movement activities of the 1960s. So I'm basically just scrolling down, and you can see that they have a lot of different kinds of primary sources too. They have snippets from interviews, they have photographs, they have maps. Here's a famous one of one of the earliest sit-ins recorded in Greensboro, North Carolina. And of course, the Library of Congress has this image. And if you look it up, just, in the Library of Congress website, if you go to loc.gov and you try to look at this image, it's a thumbnail because of, the issue of rights. A lot of their civil rights photographs are, you can only pull up a little thumbnail. You can't really get a closer look at it. It's only when they do exhibits and story maps and other kinds of things like that where they blow it up into a larger JPEG and you can now use it. So I love it when they do that. That's one way that we get around that kind of copyright thing because, well, here it is. So this is useful in a lot of different ways. And so here we have an interview from CBS News, and so talk about the March on Washington, etc. So you get the idea. So story maps are a really great way to introduce narrative into larger kind of thematic themes. We also have a couple academic articles about history and storytelling. We have one here from, the Art of Reading, an issue that they had. It's not very long. And there's one called The Teaching of American History Through Storytelling. Again, this is just a magazine article, so it's not very long. So that kind of thing would be helpful along with the literature that Ken brought up in his presentation. We have a link to StoryCorps, and if you're like me, you love when that comes up in those few minutes when you get to listen to a story and somebody telling it. And it's usually the kind of thing that's just an everyday occurrence, but it's told by the people themselves, and it's always so heartwarming. And sometimes I'm tearing up while I'm driving my car because they're so personal and relatable, even if it's, not something that's part of my own experience. And so StoryCorps is a great thing for students to explore, just to give them ideas also on how to interview family members. Like, what kind of questions are good questions to ask that'll get people talking? So we definitely linked to that. There's a blog from the Library of Congress, from the American Folklife Center, and the Veterans History Project. Where they're talking about, bringing in those stories and narratives using a veteran's life story right here. And then Then we have links to actual materials that you may or may not already be familiar with. So this is a primary source set on the Library of Congress's website for immigration and relocation in US history, because if your students have any immigration stories in their families, chances are they can connect it to primary sources, whether directly or indirectly, that you may be able to find here on one of these categories. Also, we have one of our close reading exercises for 6th grade, looking at an excerpt from the Iliad by the poet Homer, one of the very first works we have in the Western tradition. It's a very complicated text, of course, and you can't really expect 6th graders to get a whole lot out of it. So that's why there's a whole lot of scaffolding in here, and an easier translation versus a harder one, so they can see the difference that it makes. But also just kind of like, okay, who are these people that we're talking about? Adding content knowledge in little bits to help them understand this passage here on the left. And so, uh, you know, all of this can help a little, somewhat. And then I think that there's, oh, right. Okay. There's not a link in here, but when I teach the Iliad to my MTSU students, there's a cute little video on YouTube about this actual story here about the death of Sarpedon. There's a little cartoon on YouTube about it that tells that story, and it for the college students, that makes them learn this much better than reading any text. So they're, in that way, they're a lot like elementary and middle and high school students, because they're people, and that storytelling element's important for them as well. So I can't forget that. So if you're interested, I can send you that video. But okay, and then we have 2 more close reading exercises that we thought brought out this storytelling theme. One is, of course, a passage from the life of Frederick Douglass, because his life is an outstanding story, and the way he writes it is very compelling. And so we have, it's 3 pages, but it's very, very blown up font. So it's not really very texty at all, but talking about kind of the cruelties endured at the hands of the mistress of the house. And then the last one is Ballad of Booker T by Langston Hughes. And just kind of, it's a different kind of story because it's written as a poem, and that can trip students up some. So again, trying to introduce background knowledge to help them make sense, and then they can enjoy the story and kind of wonder about why Langston Hughes is telling this story about Booker T. Washington. So you learn about both of them. So yeah, I basically, that's all that I wanted to share, but I also need to make sure that I am giving you all the links to the pertinent materials. So I am going to drop into the chat box first the link to our Padlet, in case you don't have that, and then the link to our survey form. So those of you who are with us today, if you could fill that out, and then we'll be able to get your PD certificates processed hopefully next week. Kira's out, so it might be a little bit later than normal, but if you haven't heard from us in a couple weeks, then just email us and we'll get right on it. So I want to thank Ken again for explaining some of his thoughts on this to us in a way that really made me think a lot about it. And I hope that you all have some ideas. Feel free to share and email us with any kinds of inspirations for future issues and future webinars. Thanks again. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.